Robert Bailey was asleep in seat 8A when the captain's voice cut through the cabin speakers. If there are any military pilots on board this aircraft, identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. The words were calm, but something about the tone was wrong. Too sharp, too urgent. The plane went quiet. Conversation stopped. A baby cried somewhere behind row 12. People looked around, confused. No one moved. Robert opened his eyes slowly. For a second, he didn't move either. Not because he didn't understand the words, but because he understood them too well. 3 hours earlier, he had boarded Air Atlantic Flight 447 in Seattle with nothing more than a carry-on bag and the kind of exhaustion that sits deep in your bones. The airport had still been half asleep. Early morning travelers, coffee in paper cups, quiet announcements echoing across empty gates. Robert walked through it like a man who had done this too many times to care. Seat 8A. Window. He always chose the window. Less conversation. Less attention. The row had been empty when he arrived. For a moment, he had thought he might get the entire row to himself. That never lasted long. A woman in her 50s arrived just before boarding finished. Business suit. Expensive handbag. The type of traveler who knew exactly where she belonged. She glanced at Robert once. The leather jacket, the tattoos on his hands, the heavy ring on his finger. Her smile tightened almost instantly. She took seat 8B and placed her purse in the aisle seat, as if building a quiet wall between them. Robert noticed. He always noticed, but he didn't react. He leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, the kind of deep sleep only tired parents understand. The last thing he remembered before drifting off was a message on his phone from his sister. "Joanne's asleep. She asked if you're still making pancakes when you get back." Robert had smiled. "Tell her yes. Blueberries this time." Then the phone went dark. Now the captain's voice had pulled him back into the world. Any military pilots on board? Robert stared straight ahead at the seat in front of him. The words settled in his chest like weight. Around him, the cabin was beginning to shift. People whispering. A man across the aisle asking what was happening. The woman beside him gripping the armrest. Her earlier confidence gone. Fear has a way of leveling people. A flight attendant moved quickly down the aisle. She wasn't running, but she wasn't walking normally either. Her eyes scanned faces one by one. "Anyone with flight experience?" she asked quietly. No one answered. Robert felt his heart beat once, heavy and slow. He closed his eyes again. Pancakes. Blueberries. Joanne standing on a chair too close to the stove, insisting she could help pour the batter. "Daddy, I can do it." That memory came with another one. A promise. No more flying. No more danger. Just us. He had said those words 5 years earlier while holding his daughter in his arms. He had meant them. Every single one. The flight attendant reached their row. "Sir," she asked a businessman across the aisle. "Any flight experience?" The man shook his head quickly. She turned toward Robert for a moment. Her eyes lingered on the tattoos. Then she moved on without asking. Robert let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Good. Let someone else answer. This wasn't his responsibility anymore. Not after everything. The engines hummed steadily beneath the floor. 37,000 feet above the Atlantic. Somewhere far below them was darkness and ocean. Somewhere thousands of miles away, a 9-year-old girl was sleeping peacefully because she believed one simple thing. "Daddy always comes home." Robert pressed his hands against his thighs and stayed perfectly still. Then a voice spoke from 3 rows behind him. "You." It wasn't loud, but it carried through the cabin like a command. Robert turned his head slowly. The man standing in the aisle was older. Late 60s. Gray buzz cut. Military posture that age hadn't softened. His eyes were fixed directly on Robert. "You reacted when the captain made that announcement," the man said. Most people looked confused. You didn't. The cabin fell silent again. Passengers turned toward them. Robert said nothing. The man stepped closer. "I've spent 30 years in the Army," he continued calmly. "You learn to recognize certain reactions. The way someone sits up, the way their breathing changes." He stopped beside Robert's seat. "So I'll ask you directly." The woman in 8B slowly turned toward Robert. The fear in her face had changed into something else now. Curiosity, maybe even hope. The older man looked straight at him. "Are you military?" Robert felt every pair of eyes in the surrounding rows on him now. Joanne's face appeared in his mind again. Small, trusting. Blueberry pancakes, Daddy. The silence stretched for several seconds. Finally, Robert exhaled quietly. He said. The reaction moved through the cabin like a ripple. The older man nodded once. What did you fly? Robert hesitated. The answer felt heavier than he expected. F-16s, he said. The words hung in the air. The woman beside him stared. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward. Somewhere behind them someone whispered, Jesus. The older man extended his hand. Sergeant Major Dennis Cole, retired United States Army. Robert shook it automatically. Robert Bailey. Cole studied him for a moment. Then he said the words that would change everything. Then you need to stand up. Robert shook his head immediately. I haven't flown in 5 years. Cole didn't move. That doesn't matter. It does to me. Cole leaned closer, lowering his voice. That captain didn't make that announcement for no reason. Something is wrong up there. And right now you're the only person on this aircraft with combat flight training. Robert looked down at his hands. They were steady. The same hands that had once guided a fighter jet through Mach speed turns. The same hands that had signed separation papers the day he chose his daughter over the sky. I promised someone I wouldn't do this anymore, he said quietly. Cole followed his gaze. Your kid. Robert didn't answer. Cole nodded slowly. I figured. He placed one hand on the seat back. But there are 247 people on this plane who also want to go home tonight. The words landed hard. Robert looked around the cabin. A young mother holding a toddler close. A teenage girl trying not to cry. A businessman gripping his phone like it could somehow help. Ordinary people. Strangers. People who had boarded this flight expecting nothing more dramatic than a long nap over the ocean. Robert closed his eyes again for 1 second. Joanne's voice in his memory. Daddy, you promised. When he opened them again, the decision had already been made. Robert Bailey stood up. Robert Bailey stood in the aisle of seat 8A, and for a moment he didn't move. The entire cabin seemed to be watching him now. People who 5 minutes earlier had been strangers were suddenly holding their breath, as if the next thing he did might matter to them personally. The woman in 8B slowly pulled her purse from the aisle seat without saying a word. The barrier she had built earlier disappeared quietly. Robert stepped past her. The flight attendant who had been searching the rows looked up and froze when she saw him standing. You're a pilot? She asked quickly. Robert shook his head slightly. I used to be. That's close enough, she said. Please come with me. As they moved toward the front of the aircraft, Robert could feel the eyes following him down the aisle. Some hopeful, some scared, some simply confused. He didn't look back. Every step forward felt heavier than the last, like the weight of the decision was settling in with each row he passed. 5 years earlier, Robert Bailey had walked away from the sky. Back then his life had looked completely different. Captain Bailey of the United States Air Force. F-16 fighter pilot. 1,200 flight hours. 3 deployments. 2 commendations for valor. Flying had been the only thing he had ever truly been certain about. In the cockpit, everything made sense. Speed, altitude, control. Decisions measured in seconds that meant life or death. Robert had been good at it. Very good. Commanders trusted him in situations where mistakes weren't allowed. But life outside the cockpit had been less predictable. Joanne's mother left on a Tuesday morning while Robert was still deployed overseas. There had been no argument, no warning, no explanation. Just an apartment half empty when he came home and a note on the kitchen counter that said she couldn't do it anymore. Joanne had been 2 years old. For the first few months, Robert convinced himself he could handle both lives. Pilot and father. Missions in the sky and bedtime stories on the ground. But reality didn't work like that. Deployments lasted months. Children changed in weeks. He watched his daughter grow up through pictures sent by his sister. First steps recorded on a shaky phone video. First day of preschool captured in a photo where Joanne looked directly at the camera like she was searching for someone who wasn't there. Then came the moment that changed everything. Robert returned from a long deployment carrying a bag full of gifts he barely remembered buying. Joanne stood in the hallway when he walked through the door. He knelt down and opened his arms. She stared at him quietly. Then she turned to his sister and asked a question that hit harder than anything he had ever faced in the air. "Who is that?" Robert remembered the silence that followed. The way the room seemed suddenly too quiet, too big. That night, he sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to sleep. The separation papers from the Air Force sat in front of him. It was the only career he had ever wanted, the only place he had ever truly belonged. But when morning came, he signed them anyway. The day he left the base for the last time, Joanne had wrapped her small arms around his neck and whispered something he would never forget. "No more flying, Daddy." Robert had kissed the top of her head. "No more flying," he promised. Back in the present, the cockpit door came into view. The flight attendant knocked quickly. 3 short knocks. A pause. 2 more. The door unlocked with a quiet click. She opened it and stepped aside. "They're waiting for you," she said. Robert stepped inside and immediately understood why the captain had made that announcement. The left seat was wrong. The captain was slumped sideways in harness. His head tilted unnaturally, one side of his face drooping. His right arm hung uselessly beside the controls. Robert had seen that look before. Stroke. The first officer was still flying the aircraft, but barely. He looked young, maybe late 20s, sweat soaking through the collar of his uniform. His hands were locked tightly around the yoke. His breathing was fast and uneven. The moment he saw Robert, his eyes widened with desperate relief. "Please tell me you're a pilot." Robert stepped forward. "I was Air Force," he said. "F-16. For a second, the young pilot simply stared at him. Then he nodded rapidly. Okay, that works." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm Marcus. First Officer Marcus Chun." Robert moved closer to the instrument panel and immediately noticed the warning lights. There were too many of them. Hydraulic pressure indicators sitting at 0. Master caution lights flashing red and amber across the dashboard. The airplane was still flying, but it was doing it the hard way. "What happened?" Robert asked calmly. Marcus swallowed. "We lost hydraulic system first. Then be about 2 minutes later." The captain was running the checklist when he just collapsed. Robert leaned down quickly and checked the captain's pulse. Weak but steady. Alive but completely unconscious. "Stroke," Robert said quietly. Marcus nodded. "I called for help immediately, but..." He glanced helplessly at the dead hydraulic indicators. "I don't know how long we can keep control like this." Robert studied the panel again. Without hydraulics, almost everything on the aircraft became harder. Control surfaces, flaps, brakes. The systems designed to make a passenger jet smooth and forgiving were suddenly gone. It was like trying to steer a truck with the engine turned off. "How long ago did the systems fail?" Robert asked. 10 minutes maybe." Robert nodded slowly as his mind started running calculations automatically. Training returning from muscle memory buried deep in his brain. Fuel. Enough for Reykjavik plus maybe 40 minutes. Nearest airfield? Marcus answered instantly. Keflavik Air Base. Former NATO runway. Full emergency equipment. Robert glanced at the navigation display. 80 miles away. 13 minutes at their current speed. 13 minutes to bring down a crippled aircraft carrying 247 people. Robert slid into the captain's seat. The yoke felt enormous compared to the precise control stick of an F-16. He tested the pressure gently. The response was sluggish. Delayed. Like steering through mud. "Marcus," Robert said. "Call Keflavik Tower. Declare Mayday." Marcus nodded and grabbed the radio. His hands were still shaking, but his voice steadied once he began speaking. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Air Atlantic 447 declaring full hydraulic failure. Captain incapacitated. Request immediate emergency landing." The tower responded almost instantly. "Calm. Professional. Air Atlantic 447. Keflavik Tower copies your Mayday. Runway 20 is clear. Emergency services are standing by." Robert leaned closer to the instruments as Marcus finished the call. The airspeed was creeping upward. Without flaps, they would land much faster than normal. Nearly 200 knots if they were lucky. "Marcus," Robert said quietly, "have you ever landed without hydraulics?" Marcus gave a nervous laugh. "Once. In the simulator." Robert glanced at him. "And Marcus hesitated. I crashed. Robert nodded once. Then let's not do that tonight. He adjusted his grip on the yoke and stared through the cockpit windshield into the dark horizon ahead. Somewhere beyond that darkness was a runway long enough to give them chance. Behind them were 247 people who had no idea how close they were to disaster. Robert exhaled slowly. Marcus, he said, listen carefully. The younger pilot looked at him immediately. Robert's voice was calm now, the same tone he had used thousands of times before while flying combat missions. We're going to land this plane. Robert Bailey kept his hands on the yoke and stared at the instruments for several seconds without speaking. Years ago, that silence would have meant panic. Now it meant calculation. Marcus watched him nervously, waiting for instructions. Outside the cockpit window, the night sky stretched endlessly over the North Atlantic, black and cold, offering no help. Inside, the cockpit warning lights blinked steadily like small red alarms reminding them how little control they actually had. Robert moved the yoke slightly left. The aircraft answered slowly, reluctantly, like a heavy animal that didn't want to obey. He let the nose settle again and nodded to himself. Okay, he said quietly. Controls are still responding, just barely. Marcus exhaled a breath he had been holding. Barely is good right now. Robert glanced back at the captain strapped in the jump seat. The man hadn't moved. His breathing was shallow but steady. Alive but completely out of the fight. He'll need a hospital as soon as we're on the ground, Robert said. Let's just make sure we actually reach the ground first. Marcus nodded quickly. Robert leaned forward again, eyes moving across the instruments one by one. Airspeed climbing slowly. Altitude holding but unstable. Hydraulic pressure still dead. The aircraft was flying purely on momentum and engine power now. Marcus, Robert said, from this point forward we do everything slowly and deliberately. No sudden movements. Understood. Good. Because this airplane is basically a brick without hydraulics. Marcus gave a weak smile. That's encouraging. Robert didn't smile back. His mind was already building a plan. Fighter jets were different from commercial airliners, but physics was the same everywhere. Lift, thrust, drag. If control surfaces weren't reliable, there was only one other tool left. Engines. Marcus, Robert said, we're going to steer this plane using thrust. Marcus blinked. You mean differential thrust? Robert nodded. Exactly. Marcus looked at the throttles in front of him. That's not something we practice much. You will tonight, Robert said calmly. When I say add power to the left engine, you do it. When I say reduce the right engine, you do it. Every change needs to be smooth. No sudden jumps. Marcus swallowed. Got it. Robert checked the navigation display again. 60 miles to Reykjavik. Just under 10 minutes now. He keyed the radio. Reykjavik Tower, Air Atlantic 447. We are inbound with total hydraulic failure. We will require the full runway and arrestor bed. The controller responded immediately. Air Atlantic 447. Runway 20 remains clear. Emergency vehicles are staged. Arrestor bed confirmed. Robert nodded once even though the controller couldn't see him. Copy that. He set the radio down. For a moment, neither man spoke. The engines hummed steadily beneath them, the only sound filling the cockpit. Then Marcus glanced sideways at Robert. You seem pretty calm. Robert kept his eyes on the instruments. I've been in worse situations. Marcus considered that for a second. Kumba. Robert nodded once. Marcus let out a quiet breath. I'm glad you were on this plane. Robert didn't answer. Instead, he reached down and adjusted the trim slightly. The aircraft dipped, then slowly corrected itself. Outside the cockpit, the flight attendants were preparing the cabin. Passengers had been told an emergency landing was coming. Fear spread quickly in tight spaces. A mother in row 12 held her sleeping toddler against her chest, as if her arms alone could protect the child from gravity. A teenage girl gripped her father's hand so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The woman from seat 8B sat completely still, staring at the empty seat beside her where Robert had been sleeping less than 15 minutes earlier. She thought about the way she had judged him when he first sat down. The tattoos, the leather jacket, the ring. She had already decided who he was without hearing a single word. Now the entire plane was depending on that same man. Back in the cockpit, the runway lights of Keflavik appeared faintly in the distance. Just a thin line of brightness against the darkness. Robert pointed ahead. There. Marcus leaned forward slightly. I see it. Robert nodded. That's our target. He took a slow breath. From here on out, things are going to get busy. Marcus tightened his grip on the throttles. Ready. Robert began the descent. Without hydraulics, the aircraft resisted every movement. The nose dipped too fast. Robert corrected gently. Too much correction and they could stall. Too little and they'd drop like a stone. Descent rate. Robert asked. Marcus glanced down. 1,200 feet per minute. Too fast. Robert eased back on the yoke. Add 5% power both engines. Marcus pushed the throttles forward slightly. The engines roared louder. The descent slowed. 900, Marcus said. Better. Robert nodded once. His eyes moved constantly between the runway lights and the instrument panel. Each second demanded another small adjustment. Airspeed, 210. That's going to climb. Marcus looked uneasy. Normal landing speed is around 140. We're not doing a normal landing. The runway grew larger ahead of them. Crash trucks with flashing lights lined both sides like silent witnesses waiting to see how this would end. Marcus, Robert said quietly. When we hit the runway, you cut the engines immediately. Marcus nodded. Understood. Robert's grip tightened on the yoke. The aircraft shuddered slightly as another hydraulic warning flashed briefly on the panel before dying again. Systems trying to restart, Marcus said. Ignore it, Robert replied. It's dead. One of the cockpit alarms chimed sharply. Marcus looked at the airspeed indicator. 220. Robert's jaw tightened. Too fast. But there was nothing they could do about it now. Without flaps, they needed speed to stay in the air. 3 miles, Marcus said. Robert's voice remained steady. Hold power. The runway lights now filled most of the windshield. The aircraft drifted slightly left. Robert corrected using engine thrust. Reduce right engine 2%. Marcus obeyed instantly. The nose slowly swung back towards centerline. Good, Robert said. Keep following my calls. Sweat ran down Marcus's temple, but his hand stayed steady on the throttles. 2 miles. Robert adjusted the yoke again. The aircraft resisted stubbornly before finally responding. Marcus. Yeah. Whatever happens next, we keep flying the airplane. Marcus nodded firmly. Yes, sir. The runway threshold rushed toward them faster than it should have. 1 mile, Marcus said quietly. Robert's muscles tensed. This was the point where there was no turning back. The aircraft was committed. Too low to climb. Too fast to stop. Everything now depended on the next few seconds. Robert leaned slightly forward in his seat and focused entirely on the approaching runway. The lights blurred into a bright white path beneath them. His voice dropped to a whisper. Okay. Marcus swallowed. Okay. Robert tightened his grip on the yoke. Let's bring her home. The runway lights were no longer distant points. They were rushing toward them now, bright and unforgiving. Robert Bailey could see the painted numbers on the asphalt through the windshield. Too fast. Way too fast. Airspeed, he said quietly. Marcus glanced down. 225. Robert didn't react. Panic never helped anyone fly an airplane. He focused on the one thing that mattered now. Control. The aircraft was still responding to the yoke, but only slightly, like every movement had to fight through invisible resistance. Reduce left engine 2%, Robert said. Marcus moved the throttle slowly. The plane corrected its drift just enough to line up with the center of the runway. Good, Robert said. Hold it there. In the cabin, the flight attendants had finished preparing the passengers. Brace position. Heads down. Stay down. Their voices carried authority now, the calm tone of people who had practiced this moment 100 times but hoped never to see it for real. The mother in row 12 wrapped both arms around her toddler and lowered her head. The teenage girl squeezed her father's hand and shut her eyes. The woman from seat 8B stared forward, whispering under her breath. She didn't even realize she was praying. Back in the cockpit, Marcus's breathing was faster now, but controlled. 500 feet, he said. Robert nodded once. Keep calling it. The runway was enormous in front of them now, filling the entire windshield. The crash trucks on both sides flashed red and blue lights that bounced across the cockpit glass. 400. Robert eased the yoke back gently. The nose lifted slightly. The aircraft resisted. "Come on," he muttered quietly, not to Marcus but to the airplane itself. 300. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead without taking his hands off the throttles. Still 220. Robert knew that number wasn't going to drop much before impact. Without flaps, the wings simply couldn't slow down enough. They were going to hit the runway hard. 200 feet. Robert inhaled slowly. This was the final approach. Fighter pilots learned early that the last seconds before touchdown demanded absolute focus. No distractions. No second-guessing. Just fly the aircraft. "Marcus," Robert said. "Remember, engines off when I call it." "Got it." 100 feet. The runway lights streaked beneath them. The aircraft began to sink faster than Robert liked. "Add 3% power." Marcus nudged the throttles forward. The engines roared slightly louder. The descent slowed just enough. 50 feet. Robert pulled the yoke back again, trying to flare the aircraft, trying to bleed off a little speed before impact. The controls fought him the entire way. The nose dipped again suddenly. "Easy, easy," whispered. 30 feet. The runway surface was right there now, rushing upward. Marcus stared ahead, unable to blink. 20. Robert pulled the yoke back with every bit of strength in his arms. 10. Then the aircraft hit. The impact exploded through the fuselage like a detonation. Metal screamed against asphalt as the belly of the plane slammed into the runway. A violent shower of sparks erupted behind them, spraying bright orange fire across the dark runway like a comet tail. The cockpit shuddered so hard Marcus thought the windshield might shatter. "Engines off!" Robert shouted. Marcus slammed both throttles back and cut fuel instantly. The roar of the engines vanished. What replaced it was worse. The grinding howl of metal scraping across pavement. The aircraft was sliding now, completely out of power, momentum carrying nearly 200 tons of aluminum forward at terrifying speed. Inside the cabin, the force threw passengers forward against their seatbelts. Overhead bins burst open. Bags tumbled down. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with sharp hissing sounds. Screams filled the cabin. In the cockpit, Robert held the yoke steady with both hands, muscles shaking as he fought to keep the nose from digging into the runway. If the nose dropped too far, the aircraft could flip. If one wing caught the ground, the entire plane could cartwheel. Hold it, he muttered. The runway raced beneath them. Sparks and smoke blasted past the cockpit windows. "Speed?" Robert asked through clenched teeth. Marcus checked the instruments quickly. 180, 160. The aircraft slammed across uneven patches of runway. Each impact rattled the cockpit violently. "Runway ending." Marcus shouted. Robert already knew. The white centerline stripes were disappearing fast. Beyond the asphalt was the arrestor bed. Thousands of tons of loose gravel designed to stop aircraft that couldn't stop themselves. "Brace!" Robert yelled instinctively, even though the passengers had already been told. The aircraft shot off the end of the runway and plowed directly into the arrestor bed. The effect was immediate and brutal. Gravel exploded upward in massive waves around the aircraft as the belly dug into the soft surface. The deceleration slammed Robert and Marcus forward against their harnesses so violently that both men gasped. "Speed, 120." The cockpit filled with the deafening roar of gravel hammering against the fuselage like machine gun fire. The plane shook violently as it carved a trench through the arrestor bed. Robert kept the yoke steady, refusing to let the nose collapse. 60, 40. The world outside the cockpit vanished into a cloud of dust and stone. The aircraft lurched one final time. 20. Then suddenly the motion stopped. Silence flooded the cockpit so quickly it felt unreal. For 3 seconds, neither man moved. The only sound was the ticking of hot metal cooling beneath them. Marcus blinked several times, as if his brain was trying to catch up with what had just happened. "Are we stopped?" Robert slowly released the death grip he had on the yoke. His hand was shaking now. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We're stopped." The realization spread through the cockpit like dawn breaking. They had made it. Marcus let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh and almost like a sob. Then Robert's voice snapped him back to reality. "Evacuate the plane." Marcus grabbed the intercom instantly. "Cabin crew, evacuate. Evacuate. Evacuate." In the cabin, the flight attendants sprang into action. "Leave everything. Move. Move." Emergency slides deployed with loud bursts of compressed air. Passengers scrambled out of their seats, stumbling toward the exits through dust and confusion. The mother in row 12 clutched her toddler tightly as they slid down the inflatable ramp. The teenage girl collapsed into her father's arms on the gravel outside. The woman from seat 8B stumbled out of the aircraft last from her row, coughing but alive. Every passenger who reached the ground turned back toward the aircraft in disbelief. The plane sat half buried in the arrestor bed, nose down, belly torn open from the landing. But it hadn't exploded. It hadn't flipped. It had stopped. Back in the cockpit, Robert unstrapped slowly. His arms felt like they had lifted weights for hours. Marcus stood beside him, still staring forward at the cracked windshield. "You did it," Marcus said quietly. Robert shook his head. "We did it." Then he turned toward the cabin door. "Let's get everyone out of here."